to We Don't Have Time, broadcasting here from COP29 in Baku from our climate hub on the wonderful Caspian Sea. It's getting to be crunch time here at this UN climate conference. Tomorrow is supposed to be the final day. Actually, that's not correct. It's actually Friday is supposed to be the final day. And of course, the shuttle diplomacy going on very much between the G20 meeting in Brazil and the negotiators here meeting in Azerbaijan on how the money needed for developing countries to actually move forward with their national climate plans can actually be realized. So people are talking about 1 trillion a year. Let's see what happens. It's very complex right now. While they do that, and that's very important, we do what we do, and we will continue to bring a number of interesting voices from many sectors and many countries in today's broadcast. Today, we will invite leading climate scientist, Professor Johan Rockström, to our broadcast to talk about the state of the planet, a new documentary, the need for sharp business and national transition plans, and also about methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. What can we do with those to actually turbocharge a response to the climate emergency? This is one of very few events Johan Rockström is attending at this COP, and so we're very happy to have him here on our broadcast and that he could find time. And talking about methane, I suppose we're quite happy to share the great news that was announced on the broadcast yesterday that countries representing nearly 50% of global methane emissions from organic waste, you can think of food waste, farming waste, all kinds of things, have pledged to reduce these emissions. This is indeed good news, but pledges also need to be carried through by action. And that's why we need bold science and we need bold policy. And we also need that money to be raised for the developing world so they can do their part as well. We're now going to hear from two very interesting voices on the methane story because this is Buy More Time at We Don't Have Time. This is our regular show and these are pre-recorded interviews with two fascinating people. First up is an interview with Baroness Sheehan. She's a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. And she came to our studio a few days ago to share with us what she is hoping to do with the methane story in the UK and also, in a sense, around the world. And right after this, we will now an interview with Steve Hamburg. He's he's one of my new heroes, actually, because he's the chief scientist at the Environmental Defence Fund and the project lead of MethaneSAT, and which you remember is this amazing new satellite to join other satellites up there that can actually see in real time methane pouring out of oil and gas installations, waste tips and other sources, including agriculture. And they're working on even more funky stuff, like new satellites can actually image carbon dioxide coming out of various parts of the planet. So remember, if you agree that rapidly cutting methane emissions is important, which, my God, how can you not be thinking it's important after all our shows, then please go right now to wedon'thavetime.org/buy-more-time. Buy more time. wedon'thavetime.org/buy-more-time to join hundreds of others in signing a letter to your country's UN ambassador to take action right now, right here, and at speed and at scale on methane emissions in their countries. Now, let's watch those interviews that I just flagged. Let's move on. So we have another wonderful guest with us here in the We Don't Have Time studios in Baku at COP29 on the wonderful Caspian Sea. It's Baroness Sheehan, and she's chair of the House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee in the United Kingdom. Tell us a little bit about your work and particularly this focus that's now coming on methane.
Excellent. Yes, methane is a subject very close to my heart at the moment. We have spent several months looking at detail into methane on the domestic front as well as on the global stage as well, to see the difference that bearing down on methane emissions can make. And what we've found out, I think, is something that needs to be broadcast far and wide, and our reports will be published in about 2 weeks' time. We hope to carry on from the momentum after COP29 on why it's so important to deal with methane.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, the science has been around for donkey's years, but
Yeah.
it seems like, like everything in life, sometimes it has at the moment arrives. Why do you think that is with methane?
Um, I think that's such a good question. I think for a while we've been concentrating on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is responsible for, we've got about 1.3 Celsius of warming at the moment.
Hmm.
zero point 0.8 of that is attributed to carbon dioxide, but a whopping zero point 0.5 Celsius is attributed to methane. And I
Hmm.
don't think that's fully appreciated how
Mm.
potent a greenhouse gas methane is compared to
Hmm.
carbon dioxide. So for ton, methane will give you a global warming 80 times greater than carbon dioxide. It's smaller in small. It's present in smaller proportions,
Hmm.
which is great.
Hmm.
And the thing to take away from methane is that it is short-lived.
Hmm.
It's carbon dioxide can stay in the atmosphere for a couple of thousand years.
Hmm.
Methane it's more or less done its damage in the first 10, 12 years of its
Hmm.
lifetime in the environment,
Hmm.
and after that it peters away. So if we can bear down on methane emissions early and rapidly, then we
Hmm.
can really slow global warming.
Hmm.
I think there's some information in the report where Professor Piers Forster, who's the interim chair of the Climate Change Committee, which oversees the UK's delivery of our net zero target, says that in the next couple of decades, we can, if we bear down on methane, we can stop the rate of cooling from 0.25 Celsius per decade to zero point 0.1 Celsius per
Right.
decade. We can buy time
Hmm.
if we act early.
Buy more time.
We can buy more time,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's why
Yeah.
it's so important that we really try and bear down and spread the awareness, because this is a message of hope.
Hmm.
And that's what we need. It's
Yes.
not as though there's nothing that we can do.
Mm.
We
It's
know
it's
what
it's
we
a
can
golden
do.
opportunity, really,
Yeah.
for this sprint that we could undertake. I mean, the International Energy Agency says, for example, that the oil and gas industry could actually or should reduce their emissions of methane by 75%. There will be no cost for doing this, and all the technology is known.
Yeah.
I mean, I think agriculture is a bit more complex politically. But certainly oil and gas industry, waste and landfills all around the world
Yeah.
emitting methane. And of course we have these new satellites that it's like there's nowhere to hide. You can actually see it pouring out of various installations around the world.
Yeah, so let's start with oil and gas because it's such low-hanging fruit. I think Professor Stephen Hamburg, who's with the EDF, um, his sentence remains with me when he gave testimony to our committee, and he said that oil and gas, the methane that comes out from there, he says it's not low-hanging fruit, it's fruit lying on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah, let's just get on and do it. And it is a large proportion. Agriculture and the oil and the energy sector are on a par actually with their global contribution to methane, and certainly with, as you say, with the oil and gas industry, it is such a no-brainer because, as you say, the technology is well known. We just have to grab it. We just have to capture that methane that's currently spewing out of those flaring and venting chimneys. Those dreadful things causing dreadful pollution as well. We
Absolutely.
can capture that methane. It has a value. It's natural gas. It's what fires a lot of the cookers, the gas cookers and gas boilers, etc. It has economic value,
Yeah.
and the fact that the industry are unable to take that opportunity because they are resistant to change. This is just the way they've always done it. And even though there's economic value, they have to be, I think, they have to be made to walk the walk here.
So right now, as you may know, in the United States, Canada, and increasing numbers of countries, even Nigeria and now Kazakhstan, looking at it, regulations, and then the European Union has these regulations, as I'm sure you're aware, which is on if you bring gas or export gas into the EU, that you have to somehow demonstrate that you're cutting the methane
Yes.
losses, you might say, from your operations. Um, your select committee, your report will go to the government, I presume.
It goes directly to the government.
Yeah.
The government has to respond,
Hmm.
make an official response to that report,
Hmm.
and the report will be debated on the floor of the House of Lords,
Hmm.
and we hope that the message will go out far and wide.
Right. So you're hoping that the UK government, which is being quite ambitious now with its new national climate plan, its new nationally determined contribution of plus 80%, might look at this report and say, okay, maybe there's something in this to assist the UK, to its very ambitious target. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the UK hasn't. The UK was so instrumental in getting the global methane pledge signed and really successful, because it was launched at COP26, which of course the UK hosted. Alok Sharma was the president of the COP then, and I think he personally has invested a great deal into getting the global methane pledge launched. And but since then, we haven't done as much, I don't think, on the global stage as we could have done in the UK, because we have a fantastic story to tell. We've been so successful in reducing methane emissions for various reasons. We're down by about over 60%. It's quite something, actually. And so it's just getting that message out there and saying to this government, look, there are things that you haven't done, like you haven't published the UK methane action plan. It would be great to have that published with proper detail on how we reduce emissions by sector:
Yes.
agriculture, oil and gas, and waste, of course, landfill. That's a large proportion of the methane gas.
Yes. Lastly, there are other short-lived super pollutants. Some are a bit more long-lived than short-lived, but they're all more short-lived than carbon dioxide, so I suppose we put them in the same bracket in some shape or form. Dealing with these, I mean, you mentioned before the great success, we were just chatting before, of the Montreal Protocol with fluorinated gases that used to be in our fridges and
Yeah.
cooling systems and things like that. Is there an argument to at least discuss and consider some kind of protocol for these other short-lived pollutants, like, for example, nitrous oxide, which is a very strong global warming gas, of course, along with methane?
Indeed, and I'm so glad you brought up the Montreal Protocol, which in the late 80s was a huge success. And it was a success because the ozone hole was visible from space. We knew what caused it, we knew what to do to stop it. The world came together and acted as one. And where there's that political will and leadership and determination to solve a problem, the world can do it. So I have great hope that we can do this again at climate change. We're at a point, I think, where we can see what is happening. There is no longer any doubt, any room for any doubt that climate change is here with us and accelerating.
Yeah,
It really is.
Yeah.
We're hurtling towards the 1.5 and then possibly the 2.
Yes, we
need
can't let that happen.
we can't let that
No,
happen,
absolutely.
and we know what to do. We have the model for Montreal Protocol. Why not apply it? It's a
Yes.
no-brainer to these other short-lived but extremely potent greenhouse
Super pollutants.
gases.
Yeah.
Whose concentrations are increasing, and this is something that we have to take away. We know the damage these things are doing, and yet the concentration of methane, nitrous oxide, the HFCs, etc., are going up.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Baroness. That was very enlightening, and best of luck with your work.
Thank you very much, Nick.
So I'm absolutely delighted to have with me here Stephen Hamburg, who's the chief scientist with the NGO EDF, the Environmental Defence Fund, and basically the sort of linchpin of this wonderful new methane satellite, MethaneSAT, and a very distinguished scientist in his own right for many, many years. And it's super to have you here, and methane has been a bit of a thing for us broadcasting here. Every day we have a methane show called Buy More Time, and it seems that methane's getting a lot of traction, but it's probably going to get more traction with good data, and you've just released some data on this MethaneSAT and what it can actually do. Tell us a little bit about what you're finding.
So what we're able to show is that for the first time we can measure and quantify methane emissions at a scale and at a level of precision and detail that we've never had before. So that really gives us an ability to understand methane emissions, where they're occurring across the globe. In our case, we're initially starting to look at the oil and gas industry. We'll also do agriculture, and allow us to, for the first time, get direct measurements, empirical data, across the entire industry, across the entire globe, and be able to really have solid evidence of who's performing well and who's not, and how are things changing over time. I like to say it allows us to answer three basic questions. Where are the emissions? How much are the emissions? And how much are changing over time? We've never had that data directly for any greenhouse gas for an entire industry, full stop.
Amazing. Why, in your view, is action on methane absolutely critical, particularly at this moment?
Because methane is responsible for almost 30% of the warming that we experience. And unlike CO2, which persists for centuries and millennia, methane's in the atmosphere only for a decade or so. So if we reduce methane emissions, we see the positive impact on the climate very quickly. And what we know is that there are lots of opportunities to reduce those methane emissions. We can dramatically reduce methane with existing technology, and much of it at little to no net cost. So we have this huge lever that we didn't even know existed a decade ago, that now we can pull down on and start to put the brakes on the rate of warming that's occurring, which will have enormous positive benefits for humanity and the natural world.
So buy more time is not a bad slogan.
It's not a bad slogan.
Yeah.
We do need to remember that we need to both work on the short-lived climate pollutants like methane at the same time as we do double and triple down on decarbonization. We have two climate problems. We got to solve both of them. But the tools to solve them are different. They're related, but different.
You were chatting to me just before we started this interview that perhaps in the past we made a little error on somehow equating methane to its warming impact like CO2. Just explain that. That's a bit complex, but I think it's worth just pointing out.
Yeah, so in order to try and make the problem simpler, there was an agreement to use a 100-year time frame for all the greenhouse gases. But in fact, what turns out is that we have different greenhouse gases that affect us over the next few decades than the ones that affect us over the long term. When we put them together, it undervalues reductions of short-lived climate pollutants like methane, which is the dominant one, but also black carbon and others, aerosols. And what we end up doing is losing opportunities to slow the warming because we didn't recognize how important they were to the overall problem.
Right.
When we start to look at it at different time scales, we discover, in fact, we have more levers of impact, more opportunities than we realized. We just simply blinded ourselves to some of those, which was unfortunate. It was not deliberate, it wasn't malicious in any way, but it was unfortunate.
Right. So now things have changed. It seems here at COP29 and also last year at COP28, but I think particularly here, the policymakers seem to have internalized this, and let's call it an opportunity.
It's a revolution.
Yeah, it's a revolution and an opportunity for us to move, to sprint right now, and perhaps even through the lens of acting on methane, have a chance of halving emissions by 2030.
Yeah, well, we should think about it as what the rate of warming is really the measure. We do that, we talk about halving emissions. What we really want to do is slow the rate of warming, which we need to reduce emissions greatly, but we need to remember that the quantitative changes for methane and CO2 are not going to be the same. And let's pull down on these levers, both of them, and think about them as what's going to happen in the next decade. I like to think about it, what's going to happen in the rest of my lifetime? Methane's going to dominate. And what's going to happen in the rest of my daughter's lifetime? CO2 will be more important. When we think about it that way, we really do have this power, this revolution that we can take advantage of. And the good news is we know how to do it, as I said before. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
And the impacts of just doing what we know how to do are really large.
And for the first time for a while, the oil and gas industry have been given an open invite to do something positive. The question, I suppose, is will they? And there have been some readings in the last like 12 months where a certain place, certain leaks have been seen coming like every month or something like that. I read a report or whatever, and those responsible for the leaks have been informed about it, but so far they haven't done anything. So how do we make sure that the oil and gas industry and waste management and the other areas where methane comes from actually do or act on the information from MethaneSAT?
Well, I think the key here is that we provide comprehensive data that just absolutely clear where the sources are coming from in a way we've never had before. We currently have data for individual spots, and it's a little harder to make the case about how much you're emitting. What we're seeing in a lot of the data, not all of it, but much of it, is that the emissions are much higher than are being reported. So here, we no longer have to rely on reporting, we're directly measuring. This is why it's such a revolution. Almost all the greenhouse gases are calculated, not measured. We're for the first time going to measure the emissions from an entire industry, report them publicly, totally transparently, and that will allow everyone to see who are the good actors. And lots of people are making lots of claims about how well they're doing, and some are probably correct, but many of them are not. We will for the first time be able to hold people to account. Reward them, those who are really doing a good job, but also hold those who aren't to the task of meeting their obligations that they committed to. We can now do that with the data we're going to have.
So I think I mentioned we have a daily show on methane. This is a short interview with you that will be part of our overall broadcast. But we did want to invite the oil and gas industry onto our shows. I did talk to several of them, especially those associations that have been created, like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, for example. And they were like, well, we'd like to, but we don't feel we're quite ready to talk publicly. And I feel that they've probably been a bit surprised by MethaneSAT. I think they've probably been surprised also by the data that shows, as you say, that actually there's more methane coming out than we actually realized before. Not that that's a bad thing in itself. It'd be good if it wasn't happening, but it means now we have better baselines from which to actually measure success, yeah?
Absolutely. There's no substitute for empirical data. Now, I'm a scientist, so I believe in empirical data, but I also think it's the clarity of it. And remember that last year, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which is more than 50 companies that produce almost half the oil and gas in the world, made commitments to bring their emissions to very low levels. And other companies have committed. So the key here is we have commitments, and now we'll have the tools to actually directly measure whether those commitments are being met. This is really quite dramatic, I believe. The reason we invested in building MethaneSAT is we thought that having such data was critical if we're going to really realize the kinds of actions that are necessary to slow the rate of warming. In the past, calculations, has to be a lot of trust, as a common saying, right? Trust but verify. We wanted to add the verify to that expression because we did not have that before.
So we just probably like a minute and a half. Couple of things. Will MethaneSAT then mean that those NGOs that go around with the kind of handheld detectors are out of work, or do you still need those people?
No, you need them at different scales. So we're going to create the big picture. We're going to have we're going to be able to map it, quantify the total, say where the hotspots are, but we won't have the detailed data for every individual point. And that's all added. This is a team sport, right? It's not one tool that can do everything. We believe this was an important gap in our knowledge, but we need people on the ground. We need their different satellites, the satellite communities working together in a way that it never has to create a really integrated product. I work with the International Methane Emissions Observatory at the UN Environment Program that brings all the data together so you'll have one-stop shopping. We've never had that for greenhouse gases before. We've never had one place you can go and see everything that we know about a greenhouse gas and its emissions. It's still getting built, but these are amazing developments. I'm really optimistic that we are bringing the tools to bear to do the hard work that needs to be done and do it rapidly. Do we have the work still to do? Absolutely. But the levers are now visible, and we realize how big they are, and we got to collectively hold on to them and pull down on them and really get movement.
Last question. Can it detect methane from coal mines?
It can detect methane from coal mines, from agriculture and waste. So when we built MethaneSAT, we decided to do one thing as well as we possibly could, which was look at oil and gas related methane emissions. But we can do other things. We are working with the New Zealand Space Agency, and that's allowing us, they're developing a whole program around agriculture, and they'll use MethaneSAT for that. We just looked, on Saturday when I announced some of the data releases, one of the areas in Appalachia, which produce a lot of gas, also has a lot of coal, and we showed areas which was the methane was coming from coal, areas it was coming from oil and gas, mainly gas in that case, coming from landfills. So we can look at all of it, but we also have to make sure that we don't try and do everything. We do some things really well. So we're taking on oil and gas, and we will expand to agriculture, and other tools are better at waste landfills than we are. We can do it well, but we have a very big area with high precision, and those tend to be smaller areas. So the target mode instruments, the satellites, are better suited for that. And we're working together to make sure we get the data that across all of these sources.
It sounds very exciting, and let's hope that the industry sees their responsibility to respond to the data, this amazing data that you're providing with others in this team sport called Let's Get Rid of Methane. Not
Absolutely.
Natural methane, but the stuff that
The
humans,
one thing I'll add is
yeah.
that unfortunately we are seeing feedbacks in natural systems, so they're emitting more, because as the climate warms, we actually see more emissions out of natural systems. So
Right.
I wish we could just say that we'll do human, but we'll have the indirect human caused as well.
Okay. We can deal with the human much faster,
Right.
presumably. Yeah.
But we are looking at, can we do things in the natural systems to slow those added emissions as well?
Okay, that's interesting too. Probably the subject for another interview. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Best of luck with your work. It's really important. And let's see if together with what you're doing and others are doing, that we can actually maybe halve those emissions by 2030, a sprint on methane and a marathon on carbon dioxide. Yeah.
Sounds like what we've got to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.